Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here, Shanker Institute, AFT. Thank you, Leo, for the invitation to join you here today for this very timely and critically important conversation. I work at the Center for Educational Equity, which some of you may know is headed by Michael Rebell, renowned legal scholar, litigator, professor. And we use legal analysis, policy development, policy research, school-based research, public engagement, and advocacy to champion the educational rights of young people. All young people, but with a particular focus on those of young people of color, black and brown young people, I like to say, and those living in poverty of whatever color. I want to today outline a few key points that I believe are reflected in the essay that I believe you have in your packet there in your folders. And they track 4 themes. So this is to help me stay on track, and this also to help you follow some of the arguments and ideas and questions I'm sharing with you here today. The first is purpose. Right? What is the purpose of civic education in America, in the United States? Second is people. Who's involved in the development of curricula, standards, assessments toward assessing and supporting young people in developing their civic skills, knowledge, and dispositions. Third, paradigm. I argue that we need a paradigm shift from framing the disparities in access and in outcomes from achievement gaps or civic engagement or civic participation gaps to a paradigm that recognizes, as Jessica noted, the assets that our young people bring to the table, their civic knowledge, experiential knowledge, and otherwise, and that we pin the goals for all of our young people to shared goals and shared understandings rather than pinning our aspirations for young people of color in particular to the performance of white students in civic engagement, civic participation, and otherwise. And then finally, final theme or point is around power. And specifically, I want to talk about legal power for a moment. Not just our laws, but how laws are used, particularly those laws pertaining to students' educational right to preparation for civic participation. So you notice a trend there, right? Let's sort of little iteration. You got purpose, people, paradigm, and power. So without any further ado, I want to say in response to the question here that we're asked to respond to today around is it possible to achieve common ground in civic education? Yes and no. Yes and no. I say yes because I've noticed over the past couple of years of the interesting, deep conversations we've had with many folks in the civic education field is if you don't scratch the surface, if you don't talk about the ultimate goal of civic learning and civic education and the potential social and political implications of, in particular, equity in civic education, I think we're all on the same page. We can talk in abstractly, theoretically, broadly about improving our democracy, right? We want to improve civic education in order to improve and strengthen our democracy. I don't think anyone's going to take issue with that, or most people won't take issue with that. But I think about David Labourie's 1997 article, Public Goods, Private Goods, in which he trifurcates the purpose of public education writ large into democratic equality, social efficiency, and social mobility. Right? And you can imagine, democratic equality, the purpose of public education is to prepare young people to play an active and effective role in our democracy. Social efficiency, the prime purpose of public education is to plug all of the gaps in our society, make sure we have enough people doing all the things we need people to do in order to move our society forward. And then social mobility, the prime purpose of public education is it's really an asset that individuals can use to further their own financial and civic goals. And so I think when you actually when you look at the civic education field and the different camps that exist therein, you have folks who, similarly, sort of a trifurcation here, you have folks who believe civic education must be improved in order to inculcate reverence for existing democratic institutions and practices, sort of let's do more of what we've been doing, sort of historically, let's bring it back to the glorious, sort of the golden years of civic learning, but let's not tinker too much with it. You have folks sort of in the middle who are somewhat agnostic about the ultimate social and political outcomes of civic education and ramifications of changing it. So they'll say we want more discussion and debate. We want young people to examine issues from multiple perspectives. Right? We want people to critically analyze policies and so on and so forth. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, although they don't say we want this to happen so that certain groups are able to reshape, reform society so that it better serves those who have been marginalized in our country and in particular communities. And then third, you have those who are for social transformation. The specific goal of civic education and in reforming civic education and in ensuring that our policies, our laws, and our practices in the classroom and in schools reflect the best of our thinking is to ensure that we're correcting social injustices, right? To make our society live up to its rhetoric about equal opportunity and so on and so forth. And so I think moving on to, that's sort of the purpose piece. Moving on to the people, what I've found, and I mentioned the references in the essay, at a lot of the convenings in which civic education policies and practices are discussed, and Peter alluded to this a little earlier. We were at a recent convening. I've been to several over the past year. I think we see kind of the same folks travel in the same circles. Yeah, we should get our own bus, and so you just travel around the country together like a band. But as Peter noted, it's very interesting that we have a lot of great rhetoric around equality and opportunity and equity, and yet those who are most negatively affected by these policies and practices are so often missing from any activities where they're mentioned, but are often are not reflected. Their identities, their backgrounds, their communities are not properly and adequately reflected. And I would push back. I would challenge a little bit. Maybe let me not challenge. Let me add to what you said, Peter, in your critique of my suggestion. And that I think there are multiple spaces where these conversations need to happen. We at the Center for Educational Equity are looking to launch a major public engagement campaign in which we go from community to community and ask, in our case, New Yorkers, what do you think it means to be an active and effective civic participant? Right? Here's what the experts, right, those who have been doing this work for a long time, very bright, well-informed, have done a lot of important survey work to see what other people are thinking. But what do you think in your community an active and effective civic participant looks like? And I reference that because that's our constitutional right under New York state law. All young people must be prepared to be capable civic participants. Right? They must be prepared to vote, become informed voters, to serve on juries, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to be much more actually intentional about including young people, about including people of color, about including immigrants, not after the fact, not after the wizards have done their work and have a package they're ready to then foist upon, right, the populace, upon the public, but rather to make sure that in the spirit of democracy, right, our civic education processes are inclusive, right, are meaningful, are engaging, and reflect the best thinking, not just of those who have the titles, who have the brand civic education. I'm talking about, I reference young people in particular. I think we actually, in our coalition, the statewide coalition we just launched called Democracy Ready New York in New York State, a little parochial here for a moment, but we have a statewide youth leadership initiative in which we include young people in the decision-making of the coalition. We have folks who are renowned legal scholars at the table. We have professors from, we're at Teachers College, Columbia University, from other major institutions. We have folks running nonprofit organizations that serve 10,000 students. But we also have young people. Why? Not just to check a box and to say, hey, look at us, we're living up to our democratic rhetoric, but because young people have expertise and experiences, as has been noted here previously, that's integral to the development of effective policy and practices. And, there's this, what's that saying? If you build it, they will come, right? If you build it, they will come. I think we need to remix that for this purpose. If they build it, they will come, and they will sustain it, and they will implement it. And I think this is very true. We're here at the AFT. There have been debates raging for many years about imposing practices, imposing standards, imposing accountability measures on teachers without properly consulting teachers. And now, fortunately, some state policymakers and legislators have begun to wake up because teachers and others have been pushing back, saying we need to be at the table because, not just because it's right or because we should have a seat at the table, but because we have expertise and experiences that are vital, right? That you do not have, that you cannot bring to the table. I also want to very quickly mention we talk about civic ed experts. Let's talk about culturally responsive, sustaining education experts, right? Teachers, professors, litigators, right? Nonprofit people who are doing civic education work, albeit not with the civic education brand, right? Civic, culturally responsive, sustaining education is about helping young people appreciate, acknowledge, be proud of, and use their civic identity, their rather cultural backgrounds, cultural identities, in order to become more effective civic participants, right? Let's not get tripped up by the semantics here. CR, culturally responsive, sustaining education experts, including young people themselves, youth participatory action research experts, including young people themselves and educators and others, have so much to contribute to this conversation, and yet they're absent from the decision making. They're absent from these discussions and debates, largely, about how we chart a better course to a more democratic, more just democracy. Through civics education. And paradigm shift, so purpose, people, paradigm. Again, I think I already actually gave most of what I was going to say there away a little earlier. How many of you have heard of the achievement gap? Okay. What do we mean by that? We mean there's a gap, usually in performance, between, we often reference students of color, and white students. What are we doing when we say that? What are we doing when we position these two groups in that way? We're saying that white students' performance is the pinnacle, is the dream, is the goal, is the appropriate aspiration, is roughly the best that our black and brown students can do. We rarely, very rarely look at the ultimate goal that we want for all of our students, right? So let's say white students are performing, or whether it's participation in voting or whatever, pick an indicator. If 60% of them are participating in this way, right, in school or in the community, but we expect that 90% could participate and should participate in a particular civic activity, why are we going to peg black and brown students' performance to 60%, right? We're lowballing, we're shortchanging not only black and brown students, but all students by lowering the bar. Let's not do that anymore, and I think we have a rich opportunity to change that paradigm within civic education. And finally, in closing, power, particularly legal power. There are 32 states in which the highest court has declared civic education to be a prime or the prime purpose of public education under state law. 32 states, right? Most folks in civic education we've talked to, they had not been informed. Just imagine for young people and parents, particularly in some teachers, those who are most directly affected by decision-making about education and civic education specifically, they have no idea. Young people in New York, I've worked with hundreds over the past few years, they have no idea they have a right to a library media specialist. Someone to help them find good information, consult multiple perspectives, use that information to solve problems. In my community in Harlem, 90% of schools are violating state law, but not providing access to library media specialists. That doesn't happen in largely white communities. That doesn't happen in more affluent communities, right? So I think we need to democratize the law, bringing people in, but also disseminating in a user-friendly, accessible fashion policy information, legal information in a way that helps include those who are most directly affected in the decision-making toward improving civic learning opportunities for all students.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. As we turn to our final speaker, I want to encourage people to write questions on these cards. Someone will magically appear to give them out or collect them. I think that magical person is Vicki. So think about that so we can go right to getting you into this discussion after we hear from Leo Casey. Leo.